This week on The Right Side, CTV stands behind their reported allegations of Patrick Brown despite inconsistencies. BC is raising the minimum wage again, and the Alberta Treasury Branch reports that the Alberta economy could be doing better. Also, we detail the Boushie case and settle the record on acquittals. This is The Right Side, episode 56, recorded Saturday, February 17th, 2018, The Judicial Balance. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. We're back this week for another episode. Welcome back, Patrick.
Good to be back as always, and hope everyone's having a good week this week.
That's right, and if you guys are wondering what The Right Side is, if you just stumbled across this in iTunes, well, it's a podcast, obviously, since you did find it in iTunes, and what we aim to do here is we cut through the bias and sensationalism that you find in the mainstream media, and we also give you the context that's necessary to understand the news and put you on the right side of the news story, hence our name. And we've been doing that for over a year now, and we do have some prime cases where we're actually going to do that this week that goes directly into our name. So you ready to begin?
Let's start. What do you have for us?
Well, we're going to start off in Canada this week, which, you know, this story is something we had hoped that we would not have to come back to. And, you know, we discussed this, you know, the ramifications of such an event happening like this. Well, here we are. So a few weeks ago, you might recall that we spent a good deal of time here on the podcast going through the allegations against Patrick Brown, Kent Hare, and Jamie Bailey, and all three of them resigned from their respective posts in government. And this week, well, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Patrick Brown. So on February 10th of this month, the Toronto Sun came out with a story where Patrick Brown completely tore apart the allegations against him. And in this prior article that the Toronto Sun published, that was published on February 10th, Patrick Brown came out saying, "I did the math. In 2007, I didn't live in the home where I had a second-floor bedroom. It's just factually impossible for that to have happened." And this is, of course, talking about one of the allegations of the two women that came forward against Patrick Brown on January 24th of this year that resulted in him being removed as leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservatives only 3 short months before their provincial election is stated to happen. So the article then goes on to state that Brown, in fact, lived in a duplex at 138 Collier Street in Barrie, Ontario, a tiny one-bedroom ground floor apartment in a 2-story house with a bedroom that did not have a door. And now this is important because going back to the initial story, the woman in question alleges that he shut the door and had the two of them in the bedroom together. But obviously the bedroom, as Patrick Brown says, wasn't upstairs, and his bedroom didn't even have a door on it in this apartment. And the other side of the duplex here was his legal office and a separate apartment upstairs, which was rented out to someone else. And he couldn't even access that side of the apartment because that's just the way the apartment complex was built. Patrick Brown also presented to Post media affidavits from former staff attesting to the configuration of the building, and a Barrie real estate professional that was working in the area around that time personally confirmed that Patrick Brown did indeed live in the downstairs apartment, and that was the configuration of the building in question. So as you can see here, this shoots a good number of holes through the allegations that were presented against Patrick Brown. Now, that's the first allegation, but in regards to the second allegation, Patrick Brown says that the reality is that she kissed me. I had gone up to my bedroom. I wanted to look at the social media coverage from the night, and she followed me upstairs. And what he was referring to in this case was the Hockey Night in Barrie event that him and his team had just put on, so he wanted to check what the reception to that was on social media at the time. And in the actual allegation here for the second woman, it basically says here that Brown and one of Brown's friends went up to the room with her, and the incident happened after the friend left. And the friend in question actually called Post Media about this and said that Brown and the woman in question were never alone. And the friend even apparently told CTV about the allegations, but they weren't reported by CTV in the reporting that CTV did on the matter. And that's where we're heading to on this right now. So, following the woman starting to kiss Brown, Brown just drove her home because at the time he was actually seeing someone else, and she was at this event and was left rattled by what she saw here. Because, I mean, if you're seeing someone and you see another person do this to the person you're seeing, that's gonna leave an impression. And Patrick Brown drove this woman straight home after this. That's what he says. Now, jumping forward to Tuesday, February 13th, late in the evening, CTV published an online article stating that the girl in question from the first allegation says now that she was of legal drinking age and was out of high school at the time. And for anyone paying attention to the initial allegations, the allegation was that she wasn't of legal drinking age and she was in high school at the time. So this is completely tipping that allegation on its head. Now, the title of this CTV News article is Patrick Brown Accusers Stand By Allegations. Now, you might think that, okay, this is just a reaffirmation of what CTV initially reported, but it isn't until the 5th paragraph in this article that the accuser admits that at least one aspect of her story was false, and that is the aspect that CTV initially ran with this is that Patrick Brown was doing unsavory things with someone who was underage and in high school at the time to be drinking alcohol. So you have to go down to the 5th paragraph to see this. And, you know, when you look at this and what CTV put into place, it effectively means that CTV accepted a story as correct for 3 weeks and then changed the facts around the story when the accuser remembered correctly about what the event happened. And this story was out there for 3 weeks. 3 weeks that CTV had this out there.
Yeah, and I remember when we first covered this story a couple of weeks ago, that was something that I noted that seemed very inconsistent with the story at the time. I remember going through it, and I thought it was very weird that she mentioned that she was underage and drinking at a bar, and somehow she was able to get in there. And that was something that was picked on a lot by the media, and they said it basically led to the headlines that Patrick Brown was, sexually harassing an underage teenager.
And enabling
when it turns out she's not
alcohol.
even underage. Exactly. When to begin with, even if she was underage, which we find out that she's not, it turns out that she was at the bar to begin with anyway, so it's not like he was the one that was plying her with alcohol. So that whole part of the story is incorrect. It just goes to show that more of the story could be incorrect at this
Exactly.
point.
And we get to that in just a moment, but first, pollster John Wright from Angus Reid tweeted about this after CTV put it out, and he said that CTV now reports that the accuser of Patrick Brown recounts a key piece. She was not underage in bar and not in high school, but she, quote, stands by the core of her story, and CTV stands by their original story. In a court of law, this would shred a case. CTV credibility is on very, very thin ice. And he makes the key point here is that if you took this to court and you presented the initial story in court, then you come back to court the next week or even the next day and you want to change your story, you got to start the entire case over again. And it's going to basically mean that that initial case that you brought forward is completely invalid. And when you bring it forward again, you're going to be asked to present more information on it. And, the media is not being held to that account here.
Yeah, and when you lie to in a court of law as well about something that happens, that's committing perjury, and that's a criminal offense to begin with. So you're able to do this in the media and have them stand behind you, even though it's not right. Whereas in a court of law, you, as you said, you would be torn to shreds, and your case would be basically thrown out at that point.
Yeah.
Because when it comes down to it, a lot of this stuff is it's basically he said, she said. So when it comes down to it, your story has to be very accurate, because that's the only way that you can actually get a conviction on actual sexual assault, ones that actually happen, of course. And when things end up being wrong like this, it throws out of credibility anyone who actually comes forward about legitimate cases.
Precisely, precisely. And this puts us in a situation now where this initial story, having been invalidated by the various sources that have come forward, and CTV also standing by their initial reporting, and they have an exact statement here from Matthew Garrow, the director of communications for CTV News. He said that Patrick Brown's allegations regarding our reporting are false. The two women have reiterated their allegations of sexual misconduct by Patrick Brown. His attacks on our journalistic practices are groundless and wrong. And that is the official stance from CTV on this story. And, this puts us in a situation where people need to realize that CTV willingly published fake news, and now that the circumstances have changed, is unwilling to change their initial story or issue a correction. They are 100% behind their initial story, even though there have been huge doubts raised, not only by other people that have come forward, but also by Patrick Brown himself. And we've seen this so many times before, and this is the point we're getting to, where we have a major news organization and they change a story and admit to false reporting, but only by slipping in a sentence or two in mid-article. We had to go to paragraph 5 to see this in the CTV article. They didn't talk about it on TV. It wasn't the headline of this piece. It was 2 sentences buried in the middle of this article at paragraph 5. And, no one seems to usually care about this, but this is becoming more and more common in the journalism industry that they so rightly like to hold themselves to, which is kind of disgusting when you think about it. Now, the CBC also received new information about the second accuser, and Michaela Peterson, who was dating Patrick Brown in 2013 and was at the party in question and provided her account of the event, she said that she just kept following him around, like clinging to him. He would come over and talk to me, and she would go over. She just wanted to be around him, it seemed. And then she further corroborated Patrick Brown's story. I remember when Patrick went upstairs at one point, and I vaguely remember her following. He almost immediately came back down and said he was driving her home. And in regards to the first allegation, the man who apparently drove the first accuser to Brown's house completely denies driving her there in the first place. He says, "I do not recall a single incident where I took her to Patrick's. I didn't even know that they knew each other." The man wished to remain anonymous for the sake of his professional reputation, but he was later revealed as Glenn McGregor in a Facebook post that Patrick Brown published. The woman's lawyer then commented on this after the revelation, saying, "It's a collateral matter of relative unimportance." So we can have these changes in the story. It's collateral, but it's of relative unimportance.
Yeah, and by saying it's collateral matter, that basically means, well, it's something, but it doesn't really matter to the big story here. And I think when it comes down to it, when your story has holes in it, that's relatively important, I would think. Apparently the prosecutor's lawyer thinks otherwise, of course.
And, the internet was also quick to identify this as fake news coming from CTV as well. And on Reddit, which is a website where people can go and post news stories and links and images and other people vote on them, there's something called the r/Canada subreddit, and this Toronto Sun story was submitted there. And the top comment on this read as, "Am I reading this wrong? Is this a news organization saying that they stand behind news that was proven factually incorrect?" And it's also worth noting that r/Canada and Reddit in general, except for a few places in Reddit, are not part of the normal crowd to complain about fake news in the first place. And the fact that this is the top comment here says something as well. I know you and I were equally surprised when we saw this.
Yeah, we were surprised that they were all in line with this, but I think it's something that more and more people are seeing nowadays. Maybe they've been listening to us for the past year, but it's something that's becoming more and more prevalent, is that news organizations are creating fake news, and they're spreading it more and more, and it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, it's a very dangerous thing.
And people realize it. and people
And people are
realize.
starting to realize it now.
Yeah.
And that's good that
And
they're realizing it happened, because it means that they can't just trust one news website or one source. It means you have to go to other things to make sure that you got the right story.
indeed. And, to give credit where credit is due, Global News gave Patrick Brown a 30-minute long interview that aired immediately after Global National in Ontario on Wednesday, where he shared his side of the story. He went through each of the allegations and provided details on the timeline, reiterating to people that, if you feel something I did bad, call the Barrie Police. And he even gave the people the Barrie Police phone number if they wanted to do that. And, in this, we also learned that his resignation was sent out on Twitter without his permission. The interviewer said, and was taken back by this and asked for clarification. You're saying you didn't resign. Brown then replied, the resignation was sent without my permission. So that's also very interesting about this story, is that he was in effect resigned from leadership of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party without him actually sending the tweet that issued his resignation, which is really something when you think about it.
Hmm.
Really something.
It basically reeks of almost an inside job within the party, is that they wanted to get rid of him, because you have to think that even immediately after it happened, the interim leader, I think his name is Vic Fideli, he said that he asked Brown to take a leave of absence of the party until the allegations were proved one way or another. Now Brown, with this new news coming out that the allegations were false in some cases, that he thought that meant that they were proven wrong, so he came back and he wanted to start running for the party. And then he immediately after that, it seems like, or just before that, Vic Fideli kicked Brown out of the Ontario PC caucus.
Yeah, so
Like,
he's just an
kicked him out of the
independent
party.
MPP now. And, following this chain of events and this week and the interviews that have come out and the shadiness of these allegations, Patrick Brown has entered the PC leadership race, hoping to become leader once again of a party that he led just last month and that he apparently didn't resign from as well. So this is taking a dramatic turn of events, and the entire journalistic integrity of the people in Canada who produce news and whatnot is being held up for this. So credit to Global National and Global News for giving him a full 30-minute interview for this. But CTV really needs to step up their game and admit that this was a wrong story and issue a retraction on that to begin with. And to close off this story, just want to share a tweet that came from veteran journalist Charles Adler on Twitter with this. And he said, if the objective was to paint Patrick Brown as a serial sex thug, it's been a fail. He's just shy of 40. The story is 24 news cycles old. And if he was a predator, CTV phones would have been ringing off the hook with new leads. They're silent. Not even the telemarketers are calling. So, we said when we initially discussed this on Firing Line a few weeks back that even if one of these turns out to be wrong or can even be slightly disproven, that's a huge problem for everyone involved. And here we are a number of weeks later with that actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's almost as if there were, questions raised at the time, and we could tell that there was something wrong about it, but we didn't have, of course, the full information, because unfortunately we have to rely on the media to give us the news about what's going on. But when they get their stories wrong and then they stand behind those wrong stories, that creates a huge information problem where people can't actually access what the actual truth is. And that's something that should worry everyone.
Indeed. All right, moving on to BC now, something that's not as hard-hitting but still very important.
That's true. So there's been a few stories out of BC week, the trade war with Alberta notwithstanding, of course. Now, Alberta Premier Rachel Notley promises that further sanctions against BC will happen if the BC government doesn't back down from their stance of limiting bitumen flow pending an environmental review. And those could happen as early as next week, so we'll have to follow that as it happens for you listeners. Another story to break was the throne speech to begin the spring session of the legislature. And outside of a few surprises, it went pretty much as expected for an NDP throne speech. Included in the throne speech was a promise to, quote, address, demand, and stabilize BC's out of control real estate and rental market. And in doing so, they will address the effect of speculation on the housing market, which has seen prices soar in recent years. And a lot of the commitments in the throne speech come directly from the NDP's 2017 election platform. The speech includes a promise to start making the largest investments in affordable housing in BC's history. That includes social housing, student housing, seniors housing, Indigenous housing, and affordable rentals for middle income families. However, nothing concrete has been laid out just yet. That'll probably happen in the budget, which is going to be coming out next week on Tuesday. And absent in the throne speech was the promised $400 renters rebate that the NDP campaigned on and promised in the election last year. So now, other than housing, the biggest priority in the throne speech is childcare. The provincial government signed an agreement last week with the federal government that will see $153 million over 3 years come from Ottawa to cover additional spaces and affordable care. And the throne speech read, quote, safe, affordable, licensed care will become BC's standard, giving parents the peace of mind they need and quality care they can rely on. And this was the lofty quote from the throne speech. Despite being talked a lot, the $10 day per day daycare was not actually mentioned in the throne speech, and it remains a longer term goal for the NDP to implement. And what shouldn't be much of a surprise to many is that there was actually little to no focus on BC's economy and natural resource sector. As you might remember from when we were talking about the NDP election platform and their promises that they were going to do once they formed power, we mentioned that the economy and natural resource sector always seems to be missing from whenever the NDP start talking about something. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, for instance, the whole thing that this huge kerfuffle over with Alberta is about, wasn't mentioned whatsoever in the throne speech. It was very conspicuously missing. And the only thing mentioned in regards to forestry is that the government commits to, quote, revitalize the forest industry's social contract, which you could take that in a multitude of different ways because that's a very, very vague legalese. That could mean anything from increased regulation to reduced operations. And the only other thing to do with the economy is that a, quote, emerging economy task force will be launched in the spring, whatever that means.
Sounds a lot like what Rachel Notley convened last week on pipelines.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like a very NDP approach to something. We're going to create a committee to study the effects of something on something, and then we'll report back and see what that is. So, I mean, other than that, it's a whole lot of spending on social issues, and we'll have to see how the government plans to raise the money to pay for all the campaign promises that they're beginning to fulfill this term, and what that does to the province's balance books. However, I think the biggest story out of the throne speech actually deserves to be talked about all on its own, and that is that the minimum wage in BC will be going up again and will increase on every June 1st for the next 4 years. So on June 1st, 2018, it will jump from 11.35 per hour up to 12.65 per hour. In 2019, it'll go up to 13.85, and in 2020, it'll go up to 14.60, and in 2021, it'll go up to 15.20. So while that's not as quick as an increase as we saw earlier in Alberta and Ontario, it will still jump up fast enough to cause some concern for small businesses and consumers alike. Now, the CBC is quick to note that the BC Federation of Labour was unhappy with the staggering rise, quote, making 500,000 low-paid workers who are currently make less than $15 per hour wait until June 1st, 2021 to climb above poverty wage rates is not fair, said the president of the BC Federation of Labor, Irene Lanziger. And CBC also interviewed a random barista somewhere in Vancouver who was hoping for a faster rise in pay. Now, they did this, and they talked about the Federation of Labor rather than consult an economist to actually explain what would impact the increase and what that would do to the economy, especially increase prices and lower staffing for quick service industries like the food industry. Now, it's been said before, especially on this show, a few different times, but let's say it again. When surveyed on how to deal with the cost of minimum wage increase, most companies are content to pass along the cost to consumers or to employees by either raising prices or by cutting benefits or staff. And eventually, the offsets are not worth the rise in pay, and all it does is speed up the rate of inflation. I think the only thing that we can think about that this is good is that it's not happening all at once like what happened in Alberta and in Ontario. It's happening gradually every year, but it seems kind of like arbitrary numbers going up.
Yeah.
It's not really tied to any increase in the economy. It's not tied to anything like that. It's just hitting that magical, mythical $15 an hour target.
Yeah, and that number, the $15 an hour target, came from Seattle. And everyone has adopted that as their minimum wage standard when we couldn't be more different than the economy of Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Well, the economy in BC is probably the closest to Seattle out of anywhere in Canada, being on the West Coast as well. But, I mean, we work on a different currency. The Canadian dollar is worth differently than the American one. Certainly cost of living is different in Washington state as it is to here. So there's a lot of different things to go on that, but it's very interesting how everyone seems to have adopted this $15 an hour as if that's the holy grail of labor work.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that was a big surprise to me. I didn't think they were going to raise it that fast, that much this soon.
We're going to have to watch out to see what the part-time job numbers do after each July and August jobs report to see if it actually causes it to go down, because if it does, there's your reason as to why that could be. So that's definitely something to watch out for in the future.
Yes, and we'll keep an eye on that to make sure that any more news that comes out about this will come out, and we want to make sure that you guys stay on the right side of that.
That's right. And speaking of that, jumping over to Alberta, more economic news here. ATB Financial released its 2018 Economic Outlook Report, and ATB Financial is a bank that's local to Alberta and was set up, I believe, in the 1940s or 1950s, I think. It's a provincial crown corporation, and they do lots of financial work for Alberta small businesses and whatnot. But anyways, the report overall sets a good tone for the Alberta economy, but things could ultimately be better, and you need to look a little bit into the report to see what exactly it is. And most media and those in government circles here this week did say that, this is actually a good report. It means things are going just fine, and we're under, a good period in time for investment and growth in Alberta, and people should be happy with it. But, as I said, you need to drill down into the data to see what exactly is happening. And this ATB financial report highlights, something we've talked about here on the right side before. And the biggest issue they see is the growing divide between WTI, West Texas Intermediate, and WCS, Western Canada Select oil prices. It sounds familiar. It's probably because we talked about that a couple episodes on the show. The WTI oil price has hovered at around $64 per barrel US, and the Western Canada Select prices hovered at roughly $37 a barrel US. So there's a huge disconnect there with the actual prices that we're able to get for our oil, and this is caused by our inability to get the product to market. Now, when you zoom out and you look at the entire economy, it's forecast to grow at 2.8% in 2018, shrinking to 2.2% in 2019, and then just 2% in 2020. Now, these numbers are positive, and that's good, and, it's not as good as we would like to see in terms of a boom level economy, because if we get hit by some kind of recession, there's just not that much of a buffer zone to keep us in terms of positive growth. And that's something that we need to look at, and something that we should always strive to do is get that GDP growth up and lower unemployment. And that's something else that's highlighted in this report. It averaged at 7.9% through 2017, forecast to drop to 6.8% this year, and then down to 6.1% by 2020. But for comparison's sake, in October 2017, the data provided by Statistics Canada says that the unemployment rate across Canada, on average, was at 6.3%. And during this time, Alberta was the only province, along with the provinces in Atlantic Canada, to be above the national average. And as you can see here, if we held everything the same in Canada, and we fast forwarded to 2020, we would only be a hair under this unemployment rate. And that's saying something as well. It means that it's not going down fast enough. An optimal unemployment rate for both job seekers and job creators falls in the range somewhere between 3 and 5%, to the point where you don't need to bring in temporary workers, and that you're still able to actually have job seekers find jobs and job creators be able to fill the jobs that they create. And yes, while we're still above the national average, 88,000 full-time jobs were created since this time last year. Most have been in manufacturing, natural resources, finance, and the real estate industry. This report also talks about housing starts and how those are expected to be down over the next couple of years as well, due to higher interest rates and tighter rules on mortgages. And this, of course, could also ripple into the construction industry, limiting the amount of new hires that can be created in that industry as well. So there's a number of potentially problematic issues in this job report, but it's best summarized at the end here when it says that this is not to say that everything in Alberta's economy is easy. Many businesses continue to struggle, the unemployment rate is still too high, and threats beyond our control, such as NAFTA negotiations and oppositions to pipeline expansion, continue to add layers of uncertainty to our economy. And most media hailed this report as something positive for the province, but at the end of the day, there's still a lot of work to be done. And this sentence highlights it quite right, that yes, while things are going in the right direction, that's mainly a matter of circumstance, and things could ultimately be better if some policies were different. And there's an example of this. Frank McKenna, who is the TD Bank deputy chairman, estimated that over the last 7 years, Canada has lost roughly $117 billion in potential revenue from natural resources due to pipeline issues. So by fixing the issues that were highlighted in the ATV financial report, Alberta will restore investor confidence in themselves and the rest of Canada, and then we will transform our economy from one that's just getting along nicely to one that drives boom and expansion. And at the end of the day here, Canada's losing money, Alberta's losing money, and we're all losing money until this gets fixed.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's very interesting how different media and political parties will look at a certain report and they'll try and cherry pick what sounds good to say, oh, look at this. We're doing great. Economy is great. Everything's great. Please vote for us again. Whereas in reality, reports like this are really complex and they're due to a lot of different factors. And a lot of people, when they're posting something on Twitter, for instance, where there's not much time to explain yourself, a lot of the nuances that go into the report and the methodology and what gets looked at really gets overlooked, and people will look at tendencies and they'll think that that's the way that things are, when in reality there's a lot of different things that go into this.
Right. When was the last time that Alberta was compared to unemployment being on the side of the average where the Atlantic Canada provinces were?
Well, I think that it's probably been that way it's probably didn't happen overnight, and it certainly was like this for a little
Yeah,
while, but people didn't talk about it, and I don't think that a lot of people wanted to bring it up because that's something that's very clear that shows that the economic progress in Alberta was not going well.
we're even higher than Quebec. And, BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, you guys have the best unemployment rates right now, well below that average.
Yeah, I
So,
think BC was at like 4.6, which
yeah,
is right about where you want it to be. And the
precisely.
economy in BC is still going quite well and quite strong. And it's very clear the differences between BC and Alberta when it comes to the economy.
Yeah, so while the media might present this as a rosy report and the government might be happy to hear it, there's still issues in here that need to be fixed and major structural issues that aren't going away. Because let's face it, a 2% growing economy, that's fine, but that's basically sustaining itself. It's not expanding. So,
Hmm.
all right. Well, we're moving on to our firing line segment right now, and this is another big one and something that isn't being talked about in the media and has numerous ramifications.
That's true. And of course, our firing line topic this week, where we talk about something that isn't covered in the media properly. And I think this story this week is pretty much telegraphed right from the get go. We could have even talked about it last week, but let's talk about this week. So, a Saskatchewan farmer has made national news in the last week. No, we're not talking about Andrew Scheer. This was actually Gerald Stanley, who is 56, and he was charged with second-degree murder of Colton Boushie, who is a 22-year-old Cree man from the Red Pheasant First Nation, which is located northwest of Saskatoon. Stanley pleaded not guilty, and his 2-week jury trial ended February 9th with a not guilty verdict. Now, for those who aren't aware of what happened in the incident that cost Boushie his life, it's important to understand what happened beforehand to know what caused the jury to reach the verdict that it did. So, a group of 4 First Nations, including Boushie, set out from the reserve roughly 50 kilometers north of Stanley's farm near Bigar, Saskatchewan, which is west of Saskatoon. Now, the First Nations had been drinking, they went for a swimming trip in a river, and when they were coming back towards the reserve, their SUV got a flat tire. So his friends on the trip, they also had a loaded rifle in the vehicle. Now, they drove the SUV onto a few different farms to try and get help for their ailing vehicle. And at the first farm, there was no vehicle there and there was no one around. So then they ended up driving onto a second farm, where they did admit that they attempted to steal a truck, and they tried to use the rifle to break open the window to do so. Turns out that guns aren't actually that good at breaking through car windows, and that failed, and the rifle ended up in the passenger seat between Boushie's legs, and it was found out after the fact that the gun was actually loaded while they were doing this. Now, they drove onto Gerald Stanley's property after this, and they wheeled up and they tried to start his ATV. Now, Stanley is a part-time mechanic, so there were other vehicles in the yard from different customers. While one went for the ATV, another went to a truck that belonged to one of Stanley's customers. Now, Boushie's friends denied stealing Stanley's ATV, but they admitted to jumping on the ATV and trying to start it the night of the incident. So that's, kind of interesting how they jumped on the ATV, tried to start it, but they denied stealing it, of course. So Sheldon Stanley, who's Gerald's son, he testified in court saying, "As soon as we heard the quad start, I started running." Now, they were working on repairing a fence nearby, so they were already outside at this time. It was a pretty warm summer's evening, so they were working outside in the shade. So the SUV then pulled up close to the ATV, and Gerald Stanley testified that he kicked the taillight because he thought that the SUV was headed for his son, while Sheldon admitted smashing the front windshield of the SUV with a hammer. And the SUV that was driven by the First Nations then ran into a parked SUV which was belonging to Stanley's wife. She was mowing the lawn nearby. At this point, Gerald ran to his shop to grab his pistol, and he loaded 2 shells and fired 2 warning shots into the air. Now, while Gerald was getting his gun, the SUV had swung around, and Gerald Stanley said he'd lost track of where his son was at the time, and he thought that the SUV had run over his wife. He saw that the lawnmower his wife had been riding on, and it was empty at the time, and he felt pure terror. Now, Boushie's friend Jackson, who had assaulted Stanley's wife at the time, who was trying to prevent them from getting back into the SUV, he said, "I punched her," and that was in the aftermath. Now, Stanley testified that he ran as fast as he could to the SUV, and after hearing the engine rev, he went to the driver's window, intending to turn the ignition off. And he said that he reached for the keys with one hand and had the handgun in the other hand. Now, he said that his finger was not on the trigger. As he was reaching into the vehicle, he said that the Tokarev pistol accidentally fired. Now, the defense argued that this was a case of hang fire, which refers to a delay of several seconds between someone pulling a trigger, as Stanley said he did after the warning shots, and the bullet coming out. Now, the shot from the gun hit Boushie in the back of the head, and he died instantly. And a loaded .22 caliber rifle was found near Boushie's body. And it was bent out of shape and contained 5 bullets in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. Now, the jury had found that this incident was a tragic accident and found that Stanley was not culpable of murder. And there were lots of cries of racism in the media and around the country, as the jury was found out to be all white. But it turns out that almost half of the prospective jurors in the Colton Boushie case were Aboriginal persons, and this was according to one member of the jury pool. And the reason there were no First Nations on the jury in this case was because so many deliberately opted out of the process. Either they found that they were related to Boushie and his family, or they had other engagements that day. And others were openly and outwardly biased during the selection process.
Now, some people might be wondering, why are we talking about this being second-degree murder if you guys are listening from a different country? Well, unlike the United States, a person defending themselves in this case can be tried for murder, and that's where this was going. And I just wanted to clarify that if we had any international listeners in the audience, because if you're listening from a different country with different gun laws, you might be scratching your head about why this is even an issue and what is apparently close to self-defense here.
Mm-hmm. Because in most cases, if you're deemed to be found in self-defense and you're protecting your home from an intruder or something like that, you would never be found guilty of murder in this case.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Now, the cries of racism were actually very interesting when they were reported in the media, because it was seen as another case of the white people trying to put First Nations down and whatnot. But it was found that a lot of the prospective jurors that were First Nations actually were openly and outwardly biased during the selection process, and they actually stopped themselves from being able to be on the jury because one individual said that you could audibly hear some of them talking amongst themselves, discussing how they were going to, quote, hang Stanley, or they were going to make sure he gets hung, or that if they don't get the results they want, that they were going to handle it themselves. Now, of course, Stanley would never get hung, even if he was found guilty, because, of course, we don't have the death penalty in Canada. So that just goes to show that's definitely interesting remarks going on there.
And credit to the courtroom for realizing this, and the people who are talking about this for removing themselves from the jury process, because that ensures that, at least on this side of it, that the case was tried fairly. But more on that in just a bit, I think.
Of course. So after the verdict came out, which There was also something that came out that really complicated things surrounding the trial. Members of Trudeau's government actually took to Twitter shortly after the verdict was released to make some pretty interesting remarks. Now, Trudeau was in California on a speaking engagement at the time, but he took the time to write, quote, "I can't imagine the grief and sorrow the Boushie family is feeling tonight, sending love to them from the U.S." Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould remarked, quote, "My thoughts are with the family of Colton Boushie tonight. I truly feel your pain, and I hear all of your voices. As a country, we can and must do better. I am committed to working every day to ensure justice for all Canadians." And Jane Philpott, who is the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, said, quote, "Devastating news tonight for the family and friends of Colton Boushie. My thoughts and prayers are with you in your time of grief and pain. We all have to do more to we all have more to do to improve justice and fairness for Indigenous Canadians." Now, in doing so, the Prime Minister and his cabinet have totally contradicted the rule of law and politicized the entire trial by interfering with the right of a jury, which is enshrined in law, quote, "to reach the verdict they conclude is appropriate in light of the evidence, the trial judge's instructions, and the burden of proof, without having to fear that they will be pilloried by public figures for having reached the, quote, wrong conclusion."
That's pretty clear.
Yeah, that's right there in Canadian law, and it seems like
And it was the
once
Justice
again,
Minister.
this is the Justice Minister, a trained lawyer. This is the Prime Minister of Canada doing this. Once again, the Prime Minister seems to be skirting around Canadian law, and this is something that didn't get mentioned that much in the media. Certainly the tweets were mentioned, but the ramifications of the
I
tweets
don't
weren't
think we would
mentioned
be talking
whatsoever.
about this story if they didn't do this.
Yeah,
Because
we
it would have
wouldn't.
just carried out. They would have got the verdict would have been read, and there would have been no issues, and it would have just happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, some politicians, of course, made statements about it, and they reached a conclusion to this that basically didn't have anything to interfere with the trial or the attempt of an appeal, which could always happen. Now, federal conservative leader Andrew Scheer called Boushie's death tragic, but said that the independent judicial process must run its course without political intervention. He said, quote, "It's appropriate to show concern and support for the family of the victim, but I think it's important that we remember that politicians don't decide these types of things," Scheer told reporters in Halifax. He also said that this situation warranted a discussion about challenges faced by young First Nations people. In this regard, I think Scheer has the right attitude because he says that it's okay to show support and concern, but you can't politicize the trial or any criminal trial for that matter, and you also can't try and decide or sway public opinion on a certain case. And I think that's something that the cabinet ministers in this case ended up doing, say that the jury made the wrong decision. In the sense they said, we can and must do better, as if that the result could have been improved upon somehow. That was what came across there. And I think that going back to when Trudeau first was elected, in those first few months, we've found out that his words on Twitter have consequences. And you remember the story about the refugees where he said, if
Yeah.
you're fleeing persecution, you're welcome in Canada. And that's actually caused a lot of people to cross the border illegally. Now, there's also been a lot of other people talking about this, and a lot of other farmers have sided with Stanley, saying that they understand his actions. A few people said that they felt that it could have been them that was put into this situation, that it was an unfortunate incident. and a GoFundMe page was actually created, which was intended to support Stanley. It actually surpassed the Justice for Colton page that was set up 5 months earlier. Both of them were surpassing $100,000 each, but the page that was supporting Stanley passed it in just a few days.
Yeah, and I think that Andrew Scheer, like you said, has the right attitude on this, but there is also a time and a place for a discussion on self-defense laws, gun laws in Canada, relating to these kind of issues that we can have another day, and that should be had another day after cases like this, because obviously there are supporters on both sides, but when this story came out, that was not the day to have that discussion. And Trudeau and his cabinet practically invited that by going there when they were talking about their support, which, it's just astounding to see that from senior cabinet officials. I think over time we could expect that from Trudeau, but from the justice minister, no.
At this point, I think that our prime minister should know better as well. He's got people working for him that really should be telling him that this sort of thing isn't acceptable. You can't politicize trials, and that's not something that a politician should do. There should be a very distinct separation between the legislative, between the executive, and between the judicial branches of power. And the judiciary has to be set apart from the leaders of the country, because that is the only way to ensure that our justice system works independently and fairly. And that's by doing so, by politicizing it really calls into question the entire thing.
Yeah, and I mean, it even goes further than that. I think there's also a story by Ralph Goodale instructing the RCMP to investigate a comment made about Colton Boushie that was made by an RCMP officer on Facebook. So even Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale is in on this as well. So, yeah, that is a huge, huge mess. I don't know where that's going to go, but like I said, we wouldn't have been talking about that unless there was the issues with the justice system here coming from the government itself, because up until that point, I think justice was delivered fairly, wouldn't you say?
I would think so. I mean, the jury came to the result. They heard all the evidence. They even probably know more about it than most anyone in the country. And they came to the result, and we have to respect that. That's how democracy works with our judiciary system, is that we create juries of our peers to decide whether someone is guilty or not. And they came to the result of not guilty, and that has to be respected at this point.
That's right.
Until there's something that indicates that we can't respect it, we have to respect it. And that's something that is part of a strong justice system.
Yeah. And that takes us into our word of the week, talking about the justice system. And the word of the week this week is acquittal. And that is a judgment that a person is not guilty of the crime with which the person has been charged. So in this case, we would see that Stanley would have been acquitted of his crimes and potentially charged with second-degree murder, because obviously he was found guilty. So.
Now, a lot of people also, they mix up acquittal and being not guilty with being innocent. And in the court of law, innocent and not guilty are not the same things.
Precisely.
And a lot of people mix that up in the media, and just by reading certain sources, they think that if they're found not guilty, that means they're innocent. It just means that they're not guilty of that particular crime. It could have been something else, but that particular crime, it meant they're not guilty. It meant that they can't be charged for it. Because for someone to be convicted of a crime, there has to be an insurmountable standard of proof. And that burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove. And if they can't prove that, and if there is they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone did something. And if there is that doubt there, then they can't be found guilty. which is why there's been a lot of cases in the last couple decades or so where there's been high-profile cases where they've been found guilty, and it's just simply because there isn't the evidence there to commit them of the crime. And a lot of people think that acquittals mean that they're innocent, when really it just means that they couldn't prove that they were guilty, so they had to find them not guilty.
I.e., O.J. Simpson.
Exactly, that's the one I was thinking of.
All right. Well, that sums up this episode of The Right Side. If you want full show notes for this episode, that's at rightsidenews.ca. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes and rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. And we're also on social media where we share the show and other things throughout the week on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. And with that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And we'll always be here to keep you on the right side of the news, keeping you all the context you need, and to cut through all of that bias and sensationalism to make sure that you truly understand what is going on in the media and in Canadian life in general. So with that, we will see you next week, and have a good week, everyone.